Hello, this is Scott, and this is the third video in a three-part series on supply, demand, and equilibrium. This is, again, the most important chapter of the semester. Everything from here on out is going to build on this chapter, so it's really important that you have this mastered. If you have any questions, please go see a tutor, use tutor.com, read the book, use the author's videos, rewatch my videos, reach out to me. We got to make sure that you understand this because everything's going to build from here on out. Don't wait. So we already did a video on buyer theory. Buyer theory is the incentive for a buyer to buy more or buy less. We did a video on supply theory, which is the seller's perspective. And now what we're going to do is we're going to let the buyer and the seller come together in a market. Now, as you may guess, a market could be real or it could be virtual. So you could think of Cub Foods, Target, or it could be Target.com. It could be Amazon. It could be eBay. So it doesn't have to be real, it just has to be a spot where buyers and sellers come together. This video does assume that you have already watched the previous two videos. So I'm going to do some really brief recaps, but they're not nearly in depth enough for you to understand the material have you not watched the other videos. So as a brief recap, we have to start with the buyer's behavior. The buyer side is called demand, and there's a difference between quantity demanded and the demand curve. A quantity demand is the amount you're willing and able to purchase at one particular price at a specific point in time. When you put all the quantity demanded together, you get a demand schedule or a demand curve. The quantity demanded is represented by a point, and the collection of the quantity demanded is represented by a line. The notation for quantity demand is QD, and the notation for demand is D. When we talk about what can change quantity demanded, the only thing that can cause quantity demanded to change is if we change the price of the market good now. That's it. Everything else caused the demand curve to shift from the buyer's behavior. So that could be your income went up or went down. That could change how much of a good you're willing and able to buy. Now, we had to think about for each good, whether it was a normal good, an inferior good, or a neutral good, and you'll have to make some judgment calls on that. We could also change the price of related goods. So we talked about substitutes, which was like Coke and Pepsi. And we talked about complements, which was like hot dogs and hot dog buns, or airfare and hotels. Those things were bought together. We talked about preferences. So things become more popular or less popular. We talked about the number of buyers. And we talked about the expectation of future prices. Those were all things that can cause the demand curve to increase or decrease. Then we went and talked about supply. Just like on demand curve, we have a quantity supplied versus a supply. Quantity supply is your willingness and ability to produce a good or service at a particular price. It's represented by a point. If you put all those points together, you'll get a supply schedule or supply curve. The supply curve is upward sloping. Its notation is an S. When we talk about what can cause a change in quantity supply versus what can change the supply curve to shift, a change in quantity supplied can only be changed by the change in the price of the market good now. Anything else from a supplier point of view will change your ability to produce, your production capability. So the example that we used was lemonade. If the price of inputs changed, not the price of the product, so if you're in the lemonade market and the price of lemonade changes, you're going to have a change in quantity supply. But if the price of lemons or sugar or cups change, it's going to change your capacity and ability to produce. Technology changes. We talked about a lemon squeezer or electricity. As technology improves, supply increases. As technology gets worse, supply decreases. We talked about the number of sellers. As the number of sellers increase, supply increases. We talked about expectation of future prices. Think of it from the seller's perspective now, though. Maybe I have a stack of gold in my basement. It's $1,000 an ounce now, and I expect it to go to $2,000 an ounce tomorrow. My willingness to sell now at a lower price decrease because I'd rather sell it at the higher price in the future. Then we have taxes. The higher the taxes, the harder it is to produce. Now, the key mistake that people make here is on both supply and demand, an increase is a shift to the right. Don't think about up and down. Think about an increase is a shift to the right. Now what we're going to do is we have a buyer and we have a seller, or more accurately, we have a market of buyers and we have a market of sellers, and we're going to put them together. And we want to understand what is going to happen. Now the key here to really understanding this is we want to look at and think about the incentives of if I'm a buyer in this spot, what would I do? If I'm a seller in this situation, what would I do? And where will we end up? So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with supply and demand, and we're just going to overlay them on top of each other. So now we have a market for these goods. Let's call the goods the new automobile market. And let's pretend that we have a belief that the equilibrium price, the average price of a car is $20,000. Who knows? So let's start off with a price that's just too low, something below the equilibrium. Let's say the new price of a car is $2,000. I'm going to notate this as PL for a price that's low. And the idea here is that it's lower than the equilibrium price. Well, what happens? If you take that low price and bring it across to the demand curve, you're going to have the quantity demanded at the low price. If you bring that price across to the supply curve, you're going to have the quantity supplied at that low price. And what you're going to notice is that the quantity demanded is bigger than the quantity supplied. This makes sense, right? If the price of cars were a lot cheaper, more people would want to buy them. Less people would want to supply them. So now what you have happening is you have a whole lot of people who want to buy these cars and not as many people who want to sell them. Well, what do we call that when quantity demanded is bigger than quantity supplied? Well, we're going to call that a shortage. So now let's pretend that there's some people who got the car and you and I are in that group of population that did not get the car. We were willing and able to pay that $2,000 and even more than the $2,000, but we didn't get it. So what are we going to do? Well, the people in that shortage are going to look around and say, hey, don't sell to that person over there for $2,000. Sell me a new car for $3,000. We're going to start to compete and bid each other up. As we start to bid up the price, notice what happens to the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded is starting to fall. Well, why is it falling? Well, as the price goes up, the law of demand tells us that people are less interested in buying this product. As the price goes up, something is happening on the supply side too. As the price goes up, there's now more of an incentive for producers to sell a car. So the quantity supplied increases. So what's happening to that shortage? Well, that shortage is getting smaller, right? But that shortage still exists. So what's going to happen? Again, the people in that shortage are going to look around and say, don't sell the car to that person, sell to me. I will pay more. Whenever the price is below this equilibrium, there's going to be an upward pressure on price. So what happened? Whenever the price is too low, which really means that the price is below the equilibrium, even though we haven't gotten there yet, there's going to be a shortage. When there's a shortage, the people who aren't getting the goods want the goods, and they have an incentive to try and outbid the people who are getting the goods. They're going to cause an upward pressure in price because they're going to bid up the price. What about if the price was too high? Let's say we think the price of a car is $20,000, and for some reason the price of a new car comes in at $100,000. Well, what's going to happen? I'm going to notate this as PH again. So the price is high, and it's just the price is above the equilibrium price, even though we haven't gotten to equilibrium yet. When the price is very high, let's bring the price over to the demand curve, and we'll see that quantity demand is less than the quantity supplied. So we're going to bring the price over to the demand curve, and that represents quantity demanded, and we're going to bring the price over to the supply curve, and that represents quantity supplied. Our quantity supplied is bigger than quantity demanded. What do we call it when we have more stuff than what people want? Well, we're going to call that a surplus. Now let's pretend for a second that you and I are in the surplus. We have a car, and there are some people who are buying the car at $100,000. Okay, we're willing and able to sell our car for less than that. So what would we do? Now the motivation is on the seller. Now the seller looks around and says to the buyer, don't buy from this person, buy from me. I'm willing to lower my price to $95,000 to $90,000 if you'll buy from me and not from this other person. So people start buying, and as the price starts to fall, we're going to see two changes happen. As the price falls, we want to think about what's the incentive of the buyer. Well, the incentive of the buyer moves along the demand curve from one quantity demanded to another quantity demanded. As the price falls, the law of demand tells us that more people will be buying this product. So quantity demanded increased. Notice I did not say that demand increased. Both on the supply curve. As the price falls, producers have less of an incentive to produce this product. We are going to move from one quantity supplied to the next, and they have less incentive to produce, so the quantity supply decreases. So we have quantity demanded increases, quantity supply decreases. You're going to notice that our surplus is getting smaller. But if we still have a surplus, what's going to happen? Well, the exact same process is going to repeat. The people in the surplus are going to say, you know what, I'll lower my price, buy from me, not from this person, and the price falls, and the price is going to keep falling until there is no surplus. Okay, so what happened when the price was too high? When the price was too high, the quantity demanded was less than the quantity supplied, and we end up with a surplus. Notice that the surplus isn't just quantity supplied, it's quantity supplied minus quantity demanded. If there were 5,000 people who were willing to supply their cars and 1,000 people who wanted to buy cars, our surplus is only 4,000 cars. And what do we know that is going to happen when our price is somehow set above the equilibrium price? There's going to be a downward pressure on price caused by sellers wanting to lower their price to increase their sales. What about at an equilibrium price? Well, let's bring the price over to the demand curve, and let's bring the price over to the supply curve, and we notice that it's the exact same price. So quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. At that price, everyone who wants to buy a product is going to get the product. So there's going to be no upward pressure on prices. And at that price, everyone who wants to sell a product is selling their product. So there's no downward pressure on prices. We have what's called a stable equilibrium. So at equilibrium, what happened? Quantity demanded is exactly equal to quantity supplied. And equilibrium, by definition, is not a surplus nor a shortage. Everyone who wants to buy and everyone who wants to sell gets their product. We use the notation of P star and Q star to denote what's happening in the equilibrium. The P represents the market price that everyone in the market has to buy that product at. And Q represents the number of transactions happened. And you may be wondering, well, what happened to QS and what happened to QD? Well, at this point, when we're in an equilibrium, quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. And it's equal to the market quantity. So Q star is equal to both QS and QD. So what's interesting here? Think of a bowl that you use for cereal for a second. If I take my bowl of cereal and I pour milk anywhere in the bowl, it's all going to attract to the bottom. It doesn't matter whether I pour it too far to the left or too far to the right or too far in front of me or too close to me. It's all going to settle in the bottom, and we can predict where that milk is going to go. Well, that's the same thing that's happening in the market. Because it's a stable equilibrium and it's an attractive equilibrium, we know we're going to end up at the equilibrium. That is the opposite of an unstable equilibrium. So, for example, take that cereal bowl, flip it upside down. If I pour milk over an upside down bowl, that milk will spill out anywhere. We can't predict where it would go. If that was to happen, we would have no economics. We wouldn't be able to predict anything. But because it's a stable and attractive equilibrium, we could start to do a whole lot of really cool things. What does it allow us to do? Well, we're going to put supply and demand together, and we're going to be able to predict what the price and quantity is. But more importantly than that, we're able to then do what's called comparative statics, which is sort of a before and an after. We can assume a market was in equilibrium, and then something happens. And then we can predict what we think will happen to prices and quantity when there's a shock to the system. So for example, Hurricane Katrina hits. Oil production is impacted. What can we expect to happen to the price of gas? So now we could say, well, the price of gas was in equilibrium, then a hurricane hit, and it impacted supply, and supply decreased, and we're going to move from one equilibrium to the next, and we could predict what will happen to the price. We could also do this with COVID-19. Well, there are a million examples with COVID-19, but one that I'm thinking of is pork production. A lot of pork production plants got shut down during COVID-19 because people were getting sick. The number of sellers decreased. As the number of sellers decreased, supply went down. Supply decreased. As supply decreased, we will see that prices of pork increased. Let's show you what's happening with comparative statics. So what we first start off with always is supply and demand in equilibrium. And what we're trying to understand here is what happened with the change. Something happened. It could be in an orange market, the market for oranges, a frost comes and kills a bunch of the trees and supply decreases. It could be that last example, or the last two examples actually, of Katrina hit and it shut down a bunch of production plants, or COVID-19 hit and it shut down a lot of the pork production. If supply decreases, let's see what happens. So we're in an initial equilibrium and supply decreases, and we move from P1 to P2. Notice that the price has increased. Also, notice at the new equilibrium, the quantity has decreased. So we are now able to use supply and demand to predict what will happen with price and quantity. What about if supply increases? Maybe they find a cure for COVID, or maybe new buyers enter the market. So again, we're going to start off with an initial supply and demand, and we're just trying to understand at this point the direction things move. Supply increases. When supply increases, we're going to move from the first equilibrium to the second equilibrium. And we're going to move from P1 to P2, and we're going to move from Q1 to Q2. When supply increases, there are more sellers. The sellers have to compete more. The way the sellers compete more is by forcing prices down. Prices go down, and the number of buyers, the number of transactions that occur in this market will increase. What about if demand increases? Again, we're going to start off with an equilibrium, P1, P2, we're in equilibrium, and now demand increased. So maybe this is for lemonade, and it got to be a really hot day. So you could say there's a preference change, or there's a number of buyers change. It could be all sorts of things. So as demand increased, what do we have? We're going to move from P1 to P2, and we're going to move from Q1 to Q2. Buyers have to compete. That's going to force the prices up. When demand goes up, prices go up, and quantity goes up. What about if demand decreases? Maybe you're selling lemonade and it became a cold day. So preferences are people don't want lemonade when it's cold. So what's going to happen? Again, we start with an initial equilibrium where we have supply and demand. Demand is going to decrease, which is a shift to the left. As demand decreases and shift to the left, we're going to move from P1 to P2 and Q1 to Q2. Now there's nothing special about my labels. I'm just saying 1 and 2 because it makes sense to say it went from the first one to the second one. Some people use primes, P apostrophe, P double apostrophe, whatever works for you. So ceteris paribus, here is what's going on when these things change. But what happens if there are 2 changes? Now things are getting harder. So what happens if there are 2 changes? It's like a chemistry experiment. You don't put multiple experiments together at one time. You do one change and then the next. And that's sort of what we're going to be doing here. So let's say the Minnesota Vikings have a great year and the fans just go crazy for them. Demand is going to increase. And I know they have a new stadium, but let's just help me out here. Let's say they get a new stadium as well, a newer stadium, and it's even bigger. So supply increases. Notice what's happening on the demand and supply. On the quantity side, demand increasing and supply increasing both increase the quantity that's happening in the market for Vikings tickets. However, when demand goes up, it pushes prices up because buyers have to compete. But when supply goes up, there's less competition among the sellers and it pushes prices down. So which one's going to win? What we're going to do is I'm going to draw 2 graphs. And one of the graphs is going to have the increase in demand be stronger than the increase in supply. And when that happens, price is going to win. The next graph, what I'm going to have happen is the increase in supply is stronger than the increase in demand. And when that happens, price is going to go down. So let me show you how this works. So on the left, we're going to start off with supply and demand. And then what we're going to have is demand is going to dominate. So I'm going to go and draw a big increase in demand. And that big increase in demand is going to move us from the first equilibrium to the second equilibrium. And notice that pushes price up and quantity up. Next, what we're going to have is a small increase in supply. Maybe they only added 500 seats. Who knows? What's that going to do? That is, again, going to reinforce the quantity up. We're going to have more output. But that increase in supply is going to push prices down at least a little bit. It's going to partially offset that increase from the demand side. We want to think about the composite change. When we have 2 impacts, there will always be one dimension, either price or quantity, where they're both working the same direction. And there will always be one variable, either price or quantity, that is going to be offset. So when you have some that are being offset, it's like a tug of war. You have to determine which one's going to be bigger. On the right, we're going to do supply and demand again in equilibrium. And here we're going to have supply dominate. So I'm going to draw a big increase in supply, and we're going to see that prices fall and quantities increase. Now what we're going to have is a smaller increase in demand. When we have a smaller increase in demand, prices are going to go back up at least a little bit. It's going to partially offset, but yet it reinforces the quantity increasing. So when we have multiple changes, when you draw it out, look for the example to say which effect is larger, and make sure that you draw the dominant change to be substantially bigger than the non-dominant change.